everybody, I'm Greg Eisenhoff,
I'm Sean Burns.
and today we're going to be talking to you about the courts. We're going to enlighten your minds, fill it with knowledge, to give you wisdom, to take your future to a much better place. Do you agree with that, Sean?
Yeah, and this stuff's got applicability right now, especially with the things that are going on in our country here in fall of 2020. So a lot of this stuff we're going to be talking about, you'll actually see coming to fruition here in the next couple days.
There's been a lot of talk on it too in the debate, 60 Minutes, if you watched it recently. But as we basically break this down, I mean, obviously we're going to be talking about the function of the courts, jurisdictions that they have, the trial appellate courts. We're going to talk about state and federal systems as it deals with the courts. And as we look through this, what I want you to do is keep an open mind and understand why things happen a certain way with the courts. And at the end, we're going to have you write your journal actually based upon your thoughts when it comes down to Supreme Court justices and their positions. So, Sean, if you want to take the function of the court real quick, and I'll follow up with whatever else.
So there are four main functions of the court. There's the due process function, you've got the crime control function, rehab function, and the bureaucratic function. All four of these, two of these functions are focused on the individual, and two of them are focused on society at large. What's interesting about the courts is that these four functions are sometimes diametrically opposed to each other. So where you've got the due process function that looks at protecting an individual's rights against the immense powers of the state, you've also got the crime control function where you're protecting society against the individual criminals. So even though you've got these four functions of the court, they're at times in conflict with each other.
Right, and recently, I mean, if you watch any debates between Trump and Biden, they're talking about a lot of the crime, different policies that they put into place. And one of the things that was brought up was rehabilitation. So we look at the rehabilitation. I want you to think for a second, when you have somebody that is a drug dealer and they're bringing drugs in and they're pushing drugs heavily, and take the other side, take the ones who actually are the users of the drugs. Now, what we'll do right now currently is if somebody's in possession of, all right, at that point, we'll arrest them and lodge them, right? And if, let's say possession of cocaine because it's a felony. So let's say we give them prison time because they're using cocaine. The question becomes, if this person's a user because they're addicted, is it costing us more actually lodging them in prison for a long period of time? Or should we get them rehabilitation to actually stop it because maybe they couldn't afford the rehabilitation themselves? Who knows? Will the rehabilitation work once we put them through it? How many times do they need to go through rehabilitation before they're actually healed or cured of their addiction? So there's a lot of things that go into play, and you got to look at how the court has to balance. One, you got to be innocent until proven guilty, right? Due process. But then also we want to give that crime control piece to it where they also bring justice, okay, with that disciplinary fact of it. But then we also got to say, well, hold on a second. Does that person necessarily need that, or the discipline, or the rehabilitation thing? But then flip side too, courts got to keep moving, don't they, Sean?
Right.
We can't overload the courts. If we run trials on every single thing, we'd be backlog probably 50 years back if we ran every single thing that went to court.
Well, and not being efficient in bringing people to trial in a speedy fashion also cuts against the crime control function, where people are not prosecuted and punished appropriately in a timely fashion. That punishment loses some of its efficacy. So.
Absolutely. So when we start looking at jurisdiction and geographical jurisdiction and federal versus the state, there's a lot to that, including the extradition. And you had mentioned something earlier about a case you had, and you want to break it down with that a little bit?
Yeah. So you've got geographic jurisdiction. Where does the state's jurisdiction end? Well, for the state of Michigan, it ends at the state borders. For the country of the United States, it usually ends at the water's edge. Although we've got jurisdiction in our territories, like the Virgin Islands, like Puerto Rico, like Guam, territories that the U.S. owns, federal law is enforced there. Can you indict people from outside the country? Absolutely. I mean, we indicted bin Laden, we indicted more recently, we've had some Russian hackers that have recently been indicted for trying to influence our elections. You've got these concerns about where the court's jurisdiction ends. State versus state. You've got laws in the state of Michigan that may not be applicable to other states in the union. Currently, laws here in the state of Michigan, marijuana is legal. If you go to Texas, that may not be they may not have legalized marijuana yet. So if a person's arrested for a marijuana violation in Texas, the state of Michigan may not extradite them. That happens frequently with countries where most recently happened with the U.S., and I forget the case right off the top of my head, but they got two ISIS terrorists sent to the United States who were being held in England when the United States convinced England that they wouldn't pursue the death penalty against these guys because England's societal mores are against the death penalty. So the U.S. had to agree not to pursue the death penalty for these two individuals, and they were consequently extradited to the United States.
Right, so extradite, you bring up an interesting point. Some of you may have never heard this term extradite before, and when we look at state versus state and extradite, I'm going to tell you a little story. So, well, actually, let me break it down. Extradition, okay? You're going to find a lot of different things that occur, and I'm going to just break it down to county, actually. So, being a police officer, you may stop somebody here in Kent County, and they have a warrant out of the county of Montcalm, right? So let's say they have OWI, operating while impaired, drunk driving. So they have a warrant for drunk driving that they never showed up over in Montcalm County. So I stop them here in Kent County. Well, the warrant in Montcalm says, let's say, 200-mile pickup. Well, obviously, Kent County is within 200 miles of Montcalm. So what happened is I confirmed the warrant with Montcalm, and they'd say, yeah, lodge them at Kent County, and we'll come get them. Okay, so basically, they'd extradite them over to Montcalm. But now it goes into a little larger scale. So I had this one famous person, I'm not going to say the name on video, but this famous person didn't really realize it until we get the name. And basically he's at a hotel in Kentwood, and he's drugged up. I mean, he's just acting weird. So long story short, we run him. And he comes back with an attempt homicide warrant out of California. Well, they have all the states that they'd extradite from, and Michigan was one of them. So we contacted California. California at that point, that county said, yeah, we'll actually extradite him because he had a $1 million bond on it with 10%. So if he paid $100,000, then that's his $100,000 saying he'll appear in California on this court date. Well, obviously, we're not taking $100,000 on the street. So at that point, we lodged him at Kent County Jail. And then California would actually send someone in that county to come and actually bring him back over to that state of California to be looked at with those charges of attempt homicide. So whenever we're dealing with extradition, it's like when warrants are put forth, we will bring them back to that district where that crime actually occurred, depending on the range of what they will extradite the person at. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, just depending upon the severity of the crime will depend upon how far the court will extradite a person. When I was on the Fugitive Task Force, we'd arrest people here in town that were sometimes from the city of Detroit, and they'd have a failure to appear. But we'd arrest them on local charges here in Grand Rapids, say an armed robbery here out of the Kent County courts, but they have a failure to appear from Wayne County. But it only have a 25-mile pickup because Wayne County didn't want to send sheriff's deputies all the way over to Kent County to pick somebody up on a failure to appear. So a lot of times those charges would get carried over for when they'd be arrested over in Wayne County, and then they'd have to answer for the failure to appear, but they wouldn't extradite them for the charges when they're arrested outside of Wayne County.
Right on. So when we look at trial courts and appellate courts, we're going to break that down a little bit and the kind of the system, how that goes. So you want to talk anything about this slide before we bump over to the next?
Yeah, it's just two different types of courts. Trial courts, that's where you have your trial, and the appellate courts are where you appeal your verdict if you don't like what you get in trial court.
So the U.S. is a dual court system. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about this, and Sean, why don't you talk a little bit about the federal side? So obviously, you have the federal side and you have the state side, and that's how it plays out. Everything will start out here in the smaller courts, like the district court, and obviously, you can bring that up to the appellate courts, and if it goes to the state Supreme Court, it can go there, and then if the decision is appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and we'll talk about writ of cert here in a little bit, it can go that way. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah,
about
the
this side?
federal courts, so here in the state of Michigan, the federal courts and the state courts pretty much mirror each other, and they're almost called the exact same things. But in the district courts here, there's two districts in the state of Michigan. There's the Western District of Michigan, and there is the Eastern District of Michigan. Those are the two judicial districts here for the state of Michigan. The Western District is headquartered in Grand Rapids. The Eastern District is headquartered in Detroit, Michigan. The Western District has its own sheriff's, or has its own marshal's office, has its own U.S. Attorney's office, has its own court system. Eastern District mirrors that. Those two districts feed into the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. From there, appeals go up to the Supreme Court of the United States, or you'll hear it abbreviated SCOTUS. So it pretty much, in the state of Michigan, pretty much mirrors that also. They've got district courts, they go up to the circuit court appeals to the Michigan Supreme Court. What should be noticed is that the Supreme Court of the United States is the ultimate, that's the final resting spot for all appeals. If you bring a case up through the state system and it makes it up through the Michigan Supreme Court, you can still appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. But once that's heard at the Supreme Court, that's the final decision.
So on the next slide here, what you'll see is basically your lower courts. They have limited jurisdictions. So it's a district court, probate courts, and municipal courts. So when we look at those kinds of courts, we're looking at, that's where they kind of begin. The cases will begin at the district court. It'll move to the circuit court if it's a felony, and then it moves its way up to appellate courts on any appeals that one may have with the decision-making of the circuit court. And then, of course, we talked about the highest courts. We have the state Supreme Court for the state side and the Supreme Court for U.S. Supreme Court for the.
Yeah, and this slide here basically just delineates what the state of Michigan's court system looks like. And again, it roughly parallels what the federal court system looks like.
So like district court too, it'll be like a lot of different quick small things. Like let's say I pull somebody over. I had an incident where state of Michigan has paper plates that if your driving license suspended, we put the paper plate in the back if it's been so many times. So we seize your metal plate, we stick this paper plate in the back of your window, okay? If you've been arrested so many times for driving while license suspended. Well, I stop a guy for not having a plate displayed. So I stop him, and once I stop him, he's suspended. Well, guess what? The attorney's like, well, time out. Where was the paper plate? Well, the paper plate actually fell off the window. So what the defense tried to do is put a suppression hearing, okay, to say, well, the stop was invalid because technically he did have a plate, it was a paper plate, but the state failed to make the stick well enough to stay on the window, and it fell off. Well, if it doesn't stick well, it's up to that driver's opportunity still to make sure that plate's displayed. So, they wanted to run a suppression hearing, right, to find the exclusionary rule, to throw some evidence out, to invalidate my stop so that the person can't be guilty of driving while license suspended. Well, that was actually heard at the district court level, right? That suppression hearing. So, that district court, usually it all takes place. So you have the 62B District Court for Kentwood, 61st District Court over in Grand Rapids. And they go all over the place, all over the counties, but you'll have the district courts, and then usually everything will get moved down to the circuit court when they're felonies downtown Grand Rapids. And where is when we start talking federally, where's your courts mainly held over here in Michigan?
The main court, so that's the main distinction between state courts and federal courts. The main trials are held at the circuit court level for the state of Michigan. In the federal system, they're held at the district court level. The appeals move up to what's called the circuit court in the federal system. In the state system, it's called the Court of Appeals. So those are the two, but other than that, they pretty much parallel each other.
Cool. You want to hit on this one?
So the slide you're looking at here basically delineates what we were talking about, the circuit court. These circuit courts are the appellate courts in the federal system. If you look here, you'll see that Michigan is in the Sixth Circuit Court right here. They're broken down into, I think, 12 or 13 different circuit courts across the country. These circuit courts, so if you are convicted in district court, you can appeal your sentence or parts of your, let's say you felt you had ineffective counsel. You can file an appeal with the circuit court, and they'll decide on whether or not that was a appeal worth hearing or not. And then once you've filed that appeal, if you get what you get the desire you want, or you don't get the decision you want, you can then appeal up to the Supreme Court.
And this slide we pretty much talked about already.
Right.
Is there anything you want to hit on kind of with this one right here with? any
No,
of the
so
decisions?
this slide, if you, as you're looking at this slide right here, if you go back 2 slides, this basically speaks to the Michigan judicial system. This slide here talks to the federal system. So if you compare these 2 slides, you'll see where you've got overlap between the state and the federal systems.
So, some of you might say, how a case is brought to SCOTUS. What is SCOTUS? Hint, hint. That might be on a test.
Yeah, you'll probably see that later in this presentation. But SCOTUS is the acronym for Supreme Court of the United States.
So when we start talking about judicial review, we start talking about a little bit about the Supreme Court. You're gonna see a writ of, this is a tough word, okay?
Writ of cert.
Yeah, certiorari, okay, or certiorari. Most people just call it writ of cert because it's a lot easier to say writ of cert than certiorari. And I'm not even know if I pronounce it properly right now.
And I'm not even gonna try.
So basically, a writ of cert is this. So if something is brought up for the review of the Supreme Court or a higher court, at that point they'll do a writ of cert. And that writ of cert basically is asking for the lower courts to provide the information reference the case at hand. And that gives them the ability to review all the decisions that were actually made and everything involving that case so that they have a better understanding of that case when they take it to that higher court for review and possible, if the Supreme Court decides to take that case on, they have more information reference that to help them make any kind of decisions.
So what the Supreme Court does is they can look down at lower court decisions and decide whether or not they are going to hear that appeal or not.
So are you telling me they don't have to take every case, Sean?
No, and they
Oh
don't.
my!
So I don't know what their normal caseload is for a year, but they will not take every case that comes before them for an appeal. And if they don't take the case, then the lower court's opinion is the final opinion. So some of these cases they'll take, like there's a couple pending before the Supreme Court right now. One of them's on the Affordable Care Act. But there's a lot of cases that come before the Supreme Court that they don't take.
Right, so as we're pretty much talking, it goes right with this slide right here. So, I mean, basically, the process of when it goes to Supreme Court, whether they decide to take the case or not, and they review the case, and from there they'll take whatever extra.
Yeah, the court will hear oral arguments from the bench, and then they go, and this is actually their conference room where the justices sit and they debate the merits of the case. And then they make their decision on what the court's decision is gonna be.
Now, I gotta, before we jump to that next slide,
Okay.
there is a video at the very end of this in which you're gonna write your journals on. And that, I'm telling you, that was probably one of the best videos I've ever seen that depicts kind of the process. And when you look at what's going on right now in the picking of our new justice, you want to talk a little bit about that and how long they sit for?
Well, so right now, as we do this video, Justice Coney Barrett's they're probably voting on whether or not she's gonna be the next Supreme Court Justice of the United States. And short of somebody breaking ranks in the Republicans, she's gonna be the next Supreme Court Justice. Justice Barrett is, I think, 48 years of age. She will, if she sits on the bench, Most justice, I think, the justice she replaced, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was 78, I think, when she passed, or 82. She was in her 80s when she passed, so you carry that out. I mean, you're talking 30-plus years that Miss Barrett could be on the Supreme Court. Justice Barrett could be on the Supreme Court. 30 years is a long time. I mean, you're talking almost 2 generations. Most of the politicians that are currently in office will no longer be in office. Kids that are in high school right now will be in their 40s. I mean, it's a long time for a person to sit on the bench. And so the decisions she'll be making over the next 30 years are going to influence American society. So that's why a lot of people, that's why when these appointments are made, these people need to be vetted exceptionally well. And, you know, whether or not you agree with their politics or not, it's a whole different matter, and that'll be addressed in this video that Greg referenced. But you need to make sure that there's nothing in their background that prevents them from holding this office, because they're gonna be there for a while.
So when you're watching that video at the end with your journal, watch the video at the very end, and then on your journal, write down, do you agree that these people, it should be whether elected or whether an appointed position, right? Elected by the people or appointed by the president and then approved through, you know, the Senate here, which today, right?
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
voting on it today.
Yeah, so anyways, do that, and then we also want you to add this, the length of term. Do you think they should have life terms in there, or do you think it should be regulated like to 4 or 8 years? So put that in your journal. So as we talk about members of the courtroom, there's a lot of stuff that goes on here, right, Sean?
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna but we're gonna touch on the courtroom work group. And the first one that comes to mind are trial judges. You can see up here from the slide what some of their responsibilities are before the trial. They're obviously in charge of the trial, and then they conduct sentencing for the defendant. And they've also got an administrative role where there's certain administrative responsibilities that fall to the judge for their courtroom that they are also responsible for.
And as far as plea bargaining goes, a lot of people are like, why would you plea something down to something else? Well, again, if it goes to trial, we'd be backlogged forever. So, I mean, you can arrest somebody for possession of cocaine, operating while impaired or drunk driving, and driving while their license is suspended, okay? Well, you got 3 different charges. The felony is a cocaine one, right? So you have 2 misdemeanors and a felony. So the question is this, it goes to trial, or I'm sorry, basically what the defense will do is they'll talk to the prosecutor, those two will go back and forth. So the defense is probably gonna be like, hey, I'll tell you what, my client's never been arrested for drugs before. If we could drop the possession of cocaine and go with the 2 misdemeanors, can we plea that out for there? And then maybe the prosecutor may say, no way, we're gonna go possession of cocaine, and then we'll drop the 2 misdemeanors. So it all depends on what the prosecutor defense actually agrees on, then they'll take it to the judge and tell the plea from there, and then at that point, the judge will sit with or will have the person swear, and then they'll say, is this true, do you plead guilty, blah, 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 and they'll go from there. So it's kind of a process, but a lot of that stuff happens outside the actual courtroom.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about plea bargains in the next upcoming chapter next week. We discuss going to plea bargains a little more in depth. Members of the courtroom working group, again, we talk about appointment of judges in the federal system. They're appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. At the state level, there are judges that are appointed by the governor. Let's say a judge dies in office or is removed from office for whatever reason. Maybe they come up on charges themselves. That has happened in the state. They're removed from office and the governor will appoint a judge. At the state level, here in the state of Michigan, all judges are elected. So what will happen is the governor will appoint a judge to that position, and then they'll have to stand election during the next election cycle. All Michigan judges, even up to the Supreme Court, are elected by the populace.
So federal judge is a little bit different.
Yeah, selection of federal judge. So the president nominates them, even federal magistrates. They present the nominee to the U.S. Senate. The Senate then votes up or down whether that person should be seated on the bench. Federal appointments for a federal judge are lifetime appointments, just like the Supreme Court.
So there was a question asked, Sean and I, the question was, well, what if a judge now here does something that they shouldn't be doing or is very questionable or whatever, and then you started talking about the impeachment process.
Yeah, so that, it's actually happened, and I forget the case, but it's happened within the last 2-3 years. I think it was a judge in Louisiana did something improper and was removed from office. They actually were impeached by the U.S. Senate. They had an impeachment hearing, went on trial in front of the Senate, and they were impeached and removed from office. So it's unusual, doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened in the past.
And pretty much this next slide we talk about the elections and executive appointments. It pretty much just covers everything that we just spoke of.
Yeah, you guys can read this slide at your leisure. But again, it talks about members of specifically the judges.
And that's pretty much our presentation for this chapter on courts. And we highly suggest that you look at this link right here. It's a great link. It's not boring at all. It's actually
Take a look at
entertaining,
take a look at the video. I think you'll find it educational. Look to those questions right there. I think it might 1 or 2 slides after this too.
Yeah.
Talked about judicial decision-making. We already talked about the impeachment process, how judges are removed, federal judges are removed from their positions. And then we've got additional members of the courtroom working group, and we'll talk more about these additional members of the courtroom working group in the upcoming chapter next week. But you've got prosecutors, defense attorneys, you got court security officers. In federal system, that's U.S. Marshal Service. You'll sometimes hear them referred to as bailiffs. You've got the clerks of the court that actually take the pleas, they take down motions, they make transcripts of the recordings, and then you've got the court reporters make transcripts of the what goes on in the courtroom on a daily basis. So all these people, judges, prosecutors, attorneys, defense attorneys, security officers, clerk of court, and court reporters are all considered part of the courtroom work group. And finally, you've got the adversary system, and this is what our court system is based on. 3 basic features, you might want to know those. It's called ritualized aggression, and what that means is the prosecution puts their case on, the defense rebuts it, the defense puts on their defense, the prosecution rebuts it, and the hope is that at some point we get to the truth of what actually happened, more so than being victorious. Prosecutors are, one of their tenets of their job is to ensure that justice is done. Justice doesn't always mean getting a W, putting one in a W column. Justice means making sure that the victims' rights are accounted for, the defendant's rights are accounted for, and that the state laws are enforced.
When we look at the adversary system, it's pretty simple. It's the prosecutor and defense going back and forth. They're taking different angles, going at it, and hopefully at the end of the day, if the person is guilty, hopefully it's proven. If they're not, well, then good. Due process was actually held up right. So no matter whatever goes on, the adversary system is just, you're looking at your adversary, your opponent. So and that's pretty much what that covers there.
And that's the presentation. Any questions you have, please feel free to email us with any questions you may have, or just come up and grab us in class.
Other than that, great job. We'll see you later. And we are out.